Thank you very much for the invitation. It's much appreciated.
Minute rounds with Mr. Genuous. Go ahead, please, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for very interesting and insightful testimony. I want to start with the Manitoba Métis Federation. We are seeing, I think, a lot of false claims made about Indigenous identity, but about Métis identity in particular. There's of course, the recent case of former Minister Boissonnault, but I think there are many other cases. And it seems that when false claims of Indigenous identity are made, very often they're claims of Métis identity in particular. So this might seem obvious, but I think it's important if you could tell the committee directly, what does it mean to be Métis? That is, how is Métis identity properly defined? How can a claim by an individual of Métis identity be verified? And why do you think we're seeing a proliferation of these false claims around Métis identity?
Yes, thank you for the thank you, Mark. Thank you for the question.
Okay. Well, in 1870, 10,000 of the 12,000 people in Red River were Métis. There would have been another 2,500 Métis up towards the Qu'Appelle Valley up into Edmonton. Canada was supposed to settle with us with that 1.4 million acres of land that we negotiated, and there were scrip certificates there. And in addition, outside of the postage stamp of Manitoba, there was the Dominions Lands Act, which provided scrip to the Métis and the half-breeds, and it was delivered all around the same time as those numbered treaties were done. So if you want to be on our registry, you got to show either those scrip records or parish records. And so it's a very clear who the Red River Métis are, and it's very clear who they're not. And we've seen all of that in Ontario and Quebec and Eastern Canada. Those people aren't Red River Métis. And so we have our own registries. There's verification systems that are in place. And so, and that's what Lauren was talking about. That's not only for our people, but for our businesses as well. So it's very clear who we are and also who's not Métis. And that's an important question.
So anyone claiming to be Métis who is actually Métis should have a fairly easy time providing the evidence through the process that you just described.
Yeah, we use the St. Boniface Historical Society, and all of the families are connected. We know who our families are, and we know who they're not.
Sometimes we hear Liberals in particular say, "Oh, it's so complicated. It's really complicated to know what's going on." But basically, what you're saying is it's not complicated.
It's not complicated.
Okay. I wanted to ask as well about this issue of the business list. You've got various rights holders that are maintaining their own lists. Meanwhile, the government has said, no, we're going to have our own separate list. And there are people that are not on that list who are actually Indigenous businesses. There are people who are on that list who are not Indigenous businesses. It seems to me that, again, this is one of those things that gets called complicated when it's fairly simple. Can't the government, instead of creating its own list, simply say we are going to have a mechanism where those doing procurement can see the lists that we recognize? So legitimate nations have their own lists. We look at their lists. Organizations that credibly represent Indigenous peoples, they're producing lists. And rather than duplicating this work or choosing only one list, the government simply has the ability to see who's on everybody else's lists. And that's the basis of deciding who's an Indigenous business. Wouldn't that be a lot simpler?
Yeah, it would be a lot simpler. And that's, you know, I was here when Ron Irwin introduced this procurement strategy, and it wasn't very effective for a lot of years. And then when the government came in and put in targets and timetables, it started to work. But it was also, the problem was that database of businesses was contaminated right from the start. And the fact that the minister said that there's 1,100 that they just kicked out of the database says something about that database as a whole. So what we did in the United States, what happened in the United States is they created these sector councils. It was Nixon that brought in Section 8A, the business and procurement requirements for minorities in the States, and they created 49 different business councils that do verification of companies. We brought in the Canadian Aboriginal Minority Supplier Council. We were there when we set it up, and it does verification of minority businesses and Indigenous businesses. So there's a way to self-regulate it. And Lauren has a point of view on this that's important. Lauren?
Yeah, I'll just weigh in very briefly, Mark, and Mr. Chair, that the point I would make is, out of my opening remarks, really there's two fundamental questions. One is verification of majority ownership, and that can be, I'll say any party with rights to that company information can determine that. It's really on the validation piece related to identity, related to connectivity to a given Indigenous nation. And that validation process, in my view, sits best when it's connected with a self-governing Indigenous government like the Manitoba Métis Federation.
Yeah, I guess the point is, though, the government doesn't have to do this work of even, taking other people's lists and putting it together themselves. They could just say that at the point of procurement, we have a mechanism for accessing all of the lists. And is that on a list? Whose list is it on? Can we verify that it's on, that it's a real Indigenous business because it's on a real list? Like this seems so simple, and yet it's being called complicated.
Mr. Genuis, please.
Thank you. First of all, I wonder if folks from the Manitoba Métis Federation could provide us with any reaction to what happened with Randy Boissonneau, former cabinet minister, false claims about Indigenous identity, Métis identity, and now has left cabinet but remains a member of the Liberal caucus. Any reaction to those events that you want to share?
Well, I think President Chartrand addressed that in a CBC interview the other day. And what we know is we know who the real Métis are, the Red River Métis. And I don't think he ever claimed to be part of the Red River Métis. So, the challenge with this is the self-identification issue, and it's writ large in the federal public service. You just got to say you identify as Indigenous, and then Bob's your uncle. And so we've always had issues with that, not only on the procurement side, but on the employment side. So it really behooves the government and this committee, actually, because I'm glad you're looking at these issues, because it really does need some oversight in order to implement these policies, but also to police the policies. And so I think the self-identification thing, I think, really needs to be looked at closely.
It's not at all surprising that if you have a self-identification framework, that you're going to have a certain portion of people who are unscrupulous enough to self-identify as whatever they perceive to be in their interest to self-identify as in the moment. That's fairly obvious. I wanted to go to enforcement now. Mr. Beaton made some interesting, I think, important comments about enforcement, highlighting the fact that there are the most publicized cases of people that are outright making false claims of Indigenous identity, the Randy Boissonneau case, for example. But there are likely many more claims of deceptive structures. So it's not actually a person who is not Indigenous saying they're Indigenous. It's more a case of a structure that is designed to partially incorporate an Indigenous company, but in a way that preserves all of the benefit for the non-Indigenous side of that partnership. And then also, Mr. Beaton made the point about a lack of audits, that claims might be made about Indigenous benefits or about how that information, that sort of benefit sharing, work sharing process is going to unfold that are not followed through on and are not enforced. So I wonder if we could get both witness groups to comment on the failure to enforce some of these rules, why there's a lack of enforcement, who should be enforcing it, and how we can improve enforcement specifically.
Lauren, you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to provide a response. In terms of enforcement, again, coming back to my earlier points about who authorizes lists or who validates lists, and then how are those lists made available to decision makers, federal decision makers in procurement. There has to be a regime that looks at that in terms of making a determination of the list holder and the process that in which they use to verify and validate. Along with that regime comes that back end piece that you're speaking about, which is how are each of the different groups or the government of Canada going to look at the enforcement component, whether that's audit post contracting or whether that's ensuring that the right criteria or conditions are met again by the list administrators going forward. And I think more generally speaking, on some of these fraudulent activities, we're already seeing the legal action, legal consequences. To Mark's point about self-ID.
Yeah, sorry. Can I just jump in? I do want to give some time to Mr. Beaton on this just briefly, but there's a real discrepancy where you have, on the one hand, 1,100 businesses taken off the list, but on the other hand, you have 0 cases of consequences or penalties for those who engage in Indigenous identity fraud. So there's clearly a problem, but there's no penalties for anyone who is responsible for the problem. Mr. Beaton, do you want to just comment on how we can improve enforcement?
Extremely briefly,
Yeah, I mean,
please.
audits, absolutely. Done by Indigenous people, very simple. And just keep in mind that the current system is a yes/no in terms of meeting an ownership or certain percentage requirements. Indigenous leads the spectrum, so it's not just a simple yes/no. Thank you.